Well, sequel time already, huh? Can't say I'm surprised. After all, they tend to be where the real magic happens. Croc, Legend of the Gobos is a complicated game. Its premise and presentation are both executed flawlessly, but ultimately held back by certain facets of gameplay. Still, it was a huge success, garnering a big payout for developer Argonaut Software, and of course, setting the stage for an inevitable follow-up.
So it should come as no surprise to anyone that Croc 2 would release in August of 1999 for the PlayStation and Microsoft Windows. Yeah, no Saturn port this time around, though it, along with the Dreamcast version, was planned, but ultimately canned for reasons.
And while little is known about the Saturn port, it's speculated that the Dreamcast iteration would have been a sort of definitive edition with added stuff, kinda like Rayman 2. However, as per the words of lead designer Nick Cusworth himself, there was never any real work done aside from idea floating. But then we have Lewis Gordon saying level prototypes may have been a thing? Interesting. Like its predecessor, Croc 2 was also host to a pretty solid advertising campaign. Nothing as iconic as straight up murdering 3 of the biggest gaming icons, mind you, but well done nonetheless. And this time, Fox Interactive would even score a tie-in deal with Lifesavers for the US release. What can I say? They knew what the people needed. If only the next Smash Brothers game could sponsor a bar of soap.
But it's like I said the first time around, there is no better place to improve upon mistakes than a sequel. And behold, I have in my hand such a fabled thing. So without any further ado, let's take a gander at Croc the Second and see if it does, in fact, atone for the sins of its father. Or older brother. Or is it younger brother?
The story opens in the jungle, as we're shown a Gabo inventor building a plane. After a quick stroll down a path, he happens upon a group of Dantinis performing a ritual, which leads to the resurrection of Baron Dante, now sporting an eye patch. Rightfully terrified, the Gabo attempts an escape, but is quickly scooped up as the scene then transitions to Croc finding a message in a bottle. Examining the note within, he finds that it was written by crocodiles looking for their lost son, and putting 2 and 2 together with the help of King Rufus, decides to set out to the mainland where his adventure begins. Much like the first game, the in-engine cutscene only shows us what's happening in the most basic sense. With low-res textures and no real voice acting other than the character saying totally, I honestly had no idea what was going on. It's thanks to the manual I was able to make heads and tails of the entire situation, and all I can say is, okay. I mean, it's original, and Croc's motivation is much more involved, given that instead of having to save the Gabos, he wants to search for his family, but I guess I was expecting something different. What that something was, I can't exactly say, but at no point during the first game did I ever think to myself, gee, I sure hope Croc finds his biological family. Because, quite frankly, the Gabos were all he needed, given that they chose to not only take him in, but also raise him as one of their own. Maybe I'd have given it more thought if I wasn't constantly wrestling with the controls, but it is what it is. And speaking of, we are off to a phenomenal start, as, get this, not only is analog fully supported, but the tank movement is nowhere to be found.
True analog is here!
I cannot emphasize how much a breath of fresh air it was to boot this game up and discover that it handles as an action platformer should. Now, you can of course play with the D-pad, but in a shocking twist, it is the exact opposite of the last game. Like, there you had D-pad controls which were fully tank-based, but preferable to the analog, which was a weird sort of quasi-tank hybrid, kind of like a half-tank control, if that's even possible. Here, however, the analog is completely normal, while the D-pad is now the weird half-and-half setup. It's just an odd reversal. Why couldn't both control the same? Crash did it, Spyro did it, Gex did it, why couldn't Croc? Other than that, he controls relatively the same as before, coming equipped with his trademark tailspin and stomp, as well as being able to climb certain walls and hang from stuff. Newly added is the ability to perform a triple jump by hitting X a bunch of times, and also what the game calls a flip jump by pressing the 2 shoulder buttons. The former is pretty handy for accessing tricky areas, but the latter just kinda exists. It's flashy, sure, but there are never any moments where it needs to be done. Other than trying to look cool when smashing crates, I got zero use use out of it, and given that you're fully locked in until the animation finishes, it's way too dangerous to be a viable tool when platforming, since the slightest miscalculation could easily send Croc tumbling to his doom. On the topic of the shoulder buttons, one of the odder inclusions, or I guess carryovers, is the sidestep from Croc 1. There it made sense because of the tank controls. Want to position yourself for a tricky jump without having to screw around too much? Just do a sidestep. But in Croc 2, you could just go for it without having to do any tedious prep work. Simple as that. The only things missing are the quick turn, which would have been incredibly obsolete, and also the ability to swim underwater. Croc can tread on the surface just fine, but that's about it, which is curious as early gameplay trailers show off what was presumably a cut water level. Once you finally get yourself acquainted with everything, it's time for the adventure to begin, and rather than striving for a linear stage-to-stage gobbo collecting extravaganza, things are a little bit different. Instead of accessing levels from a Crash Bandicoot-esque map screen, there are now 4 gobbo villages that act as hub areas. It's within these you can talk to NPCs and complete various tasks that reward crystals, as well as visit a shop run by Swap Meet Pete and finally get into the main stages. The overall goal is whatever the level needs it to be. One could have you rescuing a gobbo, another could see Croc behind the wheel of a go-kart, and another could be entirely puzzle-based. The constant between all is the gathering of colored crystals, which when all 5 are collected, grant Croc a golden gobbo. These in turn allow you access to the village's special stage, which is home to a jigsaw piece, and yada 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 100% completion. The regular crystals are also present, but function entirely different, as rather than being the game's health bar, are now a type of currency. There are exactly 100 in every regular level, and getting hit no longer causes them to be dropped as you instead lose a heart, and when all of those are gone, you get a game over. Any crystals you've collected can then be used to purchase items at Swap Meet Pete's, like heart pots that increase the amount of hit points, though cap out at 9 for some weird reason, as well as remote-controlled clockwork gobbos, and finally gummy savers that bounce Croc up in the air. Remember that tie-in deal with lifesavers? Well, this is where it comes into play, as these are exclusive to the American release, with the classic jellies being present in PAL regions. An inconsequential change to be sure, but still an interesting bit of trivia. The overall design of things is actually pretty good. Levels have a nice flow to them with a healthy amount of clever platforming, and unlike the first game with its separate room layout, are wide open with very few transitions. This change lends itself to more complicated ideas, like a level where Croc has to rescue gobbos while putting out fires, and a dungeon-based gauntlet that sees him working against a rather explosive timer. However, it comes at a cost as they now make use of some pretty aggressive fogging techniques to mask distant areas. This wasn't an issue in Croc 1 since it didn't have to load as much, so to see it done here is understandable, but it really makes you wish every dev team back then had their own Alex Hastings. Seriously, I think we all take for granted just how crazy it was that Spyro the Dragon managed to pull this off in 1998, whereas Croc 2, which by all accounts is a relatively good-looking PS1 game, released the same year as Spyro 2 and had to resort to early 3D techniques. It's also pretty heavy on the backtracking, though not in the way you'd think. Rather than calling on Croc to make use of any new abilities learned, levels are heavily dependent on the use of goodies sold by Swap Meet Pete. There are numerous spots that can only be accessed by means of a gummy saver or clockwork gobbo, and unless you're aware beforehand, the only way you're ever going to know is by playing through levels, sometimes near to the very end, and discover that it was all for naught because, whoopsie, you forgot to buy this thing that you didn't know you had to buy. Shame on you for not being able to see the future, idiot. It's also got a lot of moments where the difficulty just decides to spike, and it doesn't always relate to the control, though I will say that Croc does have an issue with strolling off of ledges instead of jumping. But whereas one level could be a simple walk in the park with no real pushback, the next could just as easily be a pain in the ass. In fact, I'm not even so much sure that it's an issue of the difficulty ramping up, because a lot of the levels are just easy, so it's this constant teeter-totter of sorts between mind-numbing simplicity and mind-numbing infuriation. Add to this an uncontrollable camera because, yeah, though we've taken 2 steps forward with the movement, we went about 1,000 leagues backward with not being able to look around. Again, why? Croc 1 had a totally 3D camera with the analog setup, and 2 practically begs you to use the sticks, so why did something that was already nailed before not make the cut the second time around? Sure, you're given binoculars, or excuse me, magic eye zoomers at the very start, but what good does that do when you can't even move while using them? It's just a shame, because looking at any of their work makes it obvious how competent Argonaut were as a developer, but time and time again, something really dumb comes along and sullies the fun. It isn't even like they had to go all out with it. A simple mapping to L2 or R2 would have been just fine, but why do that when you can instead have them cycle through the inventory? Here's an idea. Cut the pointless sidestepping so you can use those buttons to deal with items. Or better yet, since there aren't that many, use the select button for it. In my efforts to confirm the absolute lack of camera control, I even took a gander at the Omniplay settings, which, in a few brief words, is essentially a bare-bones multiplayer mode that allows 2 players to control Croc. You might see this and think, oh, that's where it is. But no, it just allows player 2 to recenter the camera. And this is just my opinion, but the whole Omniplay thing is kinda pointless. You can do split controller co-op with any game. No special settings needed. Another issue is that certain levels have a tendency to drag on far longer than they should, most notably the ones that are based around collecting things. Late in the game, there's a particularly obnoxious one where you have to round up baby gobbos, all the while having to deal with asshole Dantinis that run away from you and shoot fire. Even after you've gotten all of that squared away, there's still the issue of the colored crystals, with one of them in an absurdly easy to fuck up Clockwork Gobbo area, and finally the Golden Gobbo statue. I've yet to mention the fact that you only get one go at these stages since dying sees you booted out and having to replay the entire level. There is absolutely no reason for it to be that punishing, and I personally think it's one of the worst things about the game, bar none. Since it's the sequel to a straightforward PlayStation platformer, there are also a few gimmick-based vehicle levels that can see Croc either having to win a race, roll around on a ball, or fly with a hang glider. And by some miracle, they aren't too bad. There's definitely an argument to be made against their inclusion, but unlike certain sequels where they manage to take up a good chunk of the runtime, here they're sparse enough to be a nice change of pace. The flying is simple, the races are short, and the snowball physics manage to feel as you'd expect without being too heavy. And hey, I guess Argonaut finally got to make that Yoshi kart racer they wanted. If anything, these are ideal for farming hearts and crystals, which is an absolute necessity since it not only helps you buy stuff, but continuing from a game over only gets you 3 hits. Then again, doing that could possibly see you having to travel from one hub area to another, and since you're only allowed to go back or forward one at a time, let's just say it could take a while. After clearing the 5 regular levels, you can then take on the village's back-to-back bosses, and I've said it before with Buck Bumble, and I'll say it again with Croc 2, a major improvement overall. No longer relegated to simply avoiding then attacking, the battles call for actual thought, as each of the Guardians, as they're called, have their own ways of being defeated. That isn't to say they're difficult. They are still very easy to take down, with one of them subverting my expectations entirely, but it helps that the process no longer repeats itself every time, which was by far the biggest detriment to Croc 1's battles. And a lot like that game, you have to fight Baron Dante twice, first in a rail-shooting plane stage, though let's be honest, Star Fox this is not, and later on top of a mountain while protecting the Inventor Gobbo. In fact, the second time is really all him. You're just there to stop Dantinis. Once that's taken care of, everything wraps up with a nice bow, as flying to a deserted island, Croc finally meets his family, with Swap Meet Pete reminding him of the game's MacGuffins. Turns out Dante somehow survived, as evidenced by this ominous shot of him stealing crocodile eggs. It's at this point you're encouraged to go back and round up any jigsaw pieces you may have missed, so you can then access these super secret villages, which is an odd marathon of sorts based around exploring Dantini-infested areas and recovering stolen eggs. Collect all of them, and you're rewarded with this. Honestly, I don't know if that's better or worse than Croc 1's secret ending, but spoiler alert, it would be the end of Croc. At least, the end of Croc as we knew him.
Talk about ending with a whimper. Croc 2 is the definition of a mixed bag. It's equal parts improvement and disappointment. I've often seen it remarked that the game isn't as good because it lacks much of the original's charm, which is definitely true. It is a very different game from the first, but I think what really muddies the water was Argonaut's apparent inability to hit any one nail on the head. The graphics are fine, the music's great, and the core platforming works well enough, But there's just such an infectious case of sequelitis here that honestly, I don't think the game ever stood a chance. But I still like it for some reason.
Suffice to say, Croc 2 was nowhere near as successful as the first, and with all of the other 3D platformers available in 1999, who could be surprised? Still, it would go on to be remade for the Game Boy Color, with the aptly named Croc 2 hitting store shelves in 2001. A quick history lesson for ya. Croc Legend of the Gobos comes out in 1997, with Croc 2 then releasing in 1999. Croc, which was the GBC iteration of Legend of the Gobos, comes out in 2000, and finally Croc 2, which is a demake of Croc 2, releases in 2001. Meaning there is technically a pair of two very different games called Croc and Croc 2 respectively, all for different consoles. Rather than playing as a 2D platformer, because that worked so well the first time, it's actually an isometric platformer heavy on exploration. It's a very different game from the mainline version, but manages to incorporate many of the level ideas and such, though is without any of the vehicles, meaning we have to imagine how annoying they could have been. As a whole, it's just okay. The isometric platforming is expectedly annoying, with many jumps bordering on leap of faith territory, and despite the levels being heavily truncated, they seem to drag on for an eternity. There are a few basic puzzles here and there, mostly testing your skill with basic math, but it's generally pretty uninspired. Poverty is also a huge issue since there's no easy way to amass crystals, and since you still need to buy things like jellies to collect colored ones, you've got to employ some cheese tactics to make fast cash. And I'ma be completely honest with you, I didn't even waste my time attempting to 100% this one. Surprisingly enough, it was developed by Natsume, who are best known for publishing the Harvest Moon series, and suddenly all of that crystal farming doesn't feel as out of place. But something tells me even Fox Interactive didn't want to be too big a part of this since it was published by THQ.
And really, I don't have any more to say about it. Despite plans for a third game, Croc would go on to fade into obscurity before receiving a few mobile games in the mid-aughts, while Argonaut would continue developing new titles, finding success with licensed properties like Aladdin, Alien, and even Harry Potter. But their next big in-house release would slice its way onto consoles in 2003 with iNinja. Oh yeah, it's Ninja time.